Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Jeremy Leffler, and I work in the Policy Office in the Division of Institution and Award Support at the National Science Foundation, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today to the Spring 2022 NSF Virtual Grants Conference. And I'm now pleased to present this session, which will cover award management at the National Science Foundation. And this session will be presented by Jeff Vieceli, Michael Horneffer, Charlotte Grant-Cobb, and Shaun Minick.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Spring 2022 Virtual Grants Conference session on award management. I'm Michael Horneffer, Senior Grants Officer and Advisor for Mid-Scale Programs, and I'm in the front office of the Division of Grants and Agreements, or DGA. My colleague, Jeff.
I am Jeff Vieceli. I am the head of the Systems Office in the Division of Institution and Award Support. My team and I are responsible for the awards management system, as well as the institution system here at the NSF. And we're at an interesting position that we know the policies as well as how the systems are programmed and react.
I am Charlotte Grant-Cobb. I am the lead analyst for the audit resolution process for the Division of Institution and Award Support in the Office of Budget, Finance, and Award Management.
Hi, my name is Shaun Minick. I'm the branch chief for the Cost Analysis and Pre-Award Branch Division within the Division of Institution and Award Support. My group is responsible for pre-award budget reviews and proposal reviews. Thank you.
Thank you, Shaun. And we all appreciate you joining us today. So going through the agenda for the session, we'll first be reviewing the award process, which is basically how award funding at NSF is obligated. Then we'll be covering the primary drivers for delays to that award-making process. We're then going to pivot to post-award notifications and requests, which is basically prior approval governance. Following that, we'll take a look at the processes around no-cost extensions and award transfer issuances. Our colleagues in the cost analysis and pre-award branch will then talk with us about conducting good award oversight. And lastly, we're going to cover awardee responsibilities. And this last grouping of slides here will definitely help you be successful in your oversight of NSF awards. Next slide, please. So here are the mission statements for both my organization, DGA, and DIAS. For DGA, we're a service-oriented and customer-oriented organization that provides direct support and oversight for NSF's programs and activities at all stages of the award lifecycle. For DIAS, their mission is to provide sustained excellence in stewardship across the grants lifecycle through state-of-the-art business practices and exemplary business assistance to key stakeholders within the NSF and across the research community. They also demonstrate organizational excellence, agility, and innovation by ensuring NSF leadership within the federal research and development enterprise. Next slide. So here's the NSF award process kind of at a 2,000-foot level. And this is the review process that we follow for grants and cooperative agreements. So for the first part of this process flow, program solicitations result in proposal submissions that are then reviewed by program. Program officers review the proposals for scientific merit and either issue a recommendation or a decline for potential award funding. If the program officer determines that a project is recommended to be funded, it's then given to DGA for review by a grants officer who's assigned to oversee a particular science portfolio or a science thematic area. Now, NSF grants officers differ from program officers in that we assess the proposals against the administrative, financial, and policy-driven requirements. So essentially, your grants officer is in charge of award compliance throughout this process overall. Depending on the results of their reviews, grants officers could either approve and obligate, and instead of obligate, we use the term award, or instead of obligating or awarding, we have the ability to decline funding. In the case of these declines, they would be done for financial and administrative reasons. And any decline would be done in alignment with NSF's risk-based framework, which is available in the uniform guidance. And the citation to that guidance, I believe, is 2 CFR 200-205. Next slide. So what kind of awards does DGA manage? So we do grants, cooperative agreements, and fellowship awards. And it's important to note that these are all federal financial assistance awards, which really actually gets into the distinction between what grants are and what contracts are. So for grants, and grants include cooperative agreements and fellowships, grants are intended to stimulate or implement some public purpose. On the other hand, contracts are financial instruments that are intended to acquire goods or services for the direct benefit of the NSF. And it's really important to note this essential distinction between the two funding instruments. Next slide, please. So looking at what we do annually, just to give you some statistics, DGA typically processes around 12,000 new projects, 5,000 supplements and continuing grant increments, and just about 5,000 non-funded actions. And we do all this processing on an annual basis. Next slide. Here, we have listed some of the primary drivers behind the delays to DGA's award-making process. And these include overdue project reports, and I believe Jeff will talk more about these in the next slide. Another reason would be not following solicitation requirements, missing IRB or IACUC approvals, and unallowable or unjustified costs. So now to talk more about overdue project reports, I'll hand it to Jeff.
As Michael said, overdue project reports, it's a big issue for the National Science Foundation. The first thing that I will say is please don't let it happen. When it does happen, it actually blocks the approvals of funding as well as non-funding actions on the subject award, as well as any other award that the PIs or co-PIs might also be associated with. So that means the awards won't get, not only won't the subject award get those new funds, say incremental funding or supplemental funding, the no-cost extension, the change of PIs or co-PIs, additions of subawards, any of those items will not be approved, not only for the award that has the overdue project report, but also any of the projects or awards that the PIs and co-PIs might also be on. So it's sort of this spider web effect, so that you have, say a co-PI is on one award, but they are a PI on a second award. That second award is also blocked until those overdue project reports are taken care of and cleared up. The other thing that's on here is the uniform guidance that was issued in August of 2020, I believe, includes information about agencies must report overdue project reports as a compliance issue to PAPPG, which is the Federal Awardee Performance and Integrity Information System. And we have a slide where we'll go in more depth into that later, but I did want to mention it here. You don't want to be reported to PAPPG. Some additional information about our project reports. The annual project reports are due annually. You'd be surprised how many questions we get about that. Annual is defined as 12 months. So every 12 months, you would be expected to provide that APR. The APRs are due within 90 days of the expiration date of the budget period. So that's basically, you have that start date of the award. From that start date, give yourselves 12 months and go back 90 days from there. So again, if you really read the policy, it is within or at least 90 days prior to the end of that budget period that those APRs should come in. The APRs are approved by the program officer. They're reviewed. They may be returned to the PI for the PI to make additional changes if the PO wants them. Moving on to the FPR, it's the same thing. They are approved and reviewed by the program officers. They may be reviewed. They should be submitted by 120 days after the end date of the award. If they become overdue, again, things become more interesting, we'll say. Next slide, please. Here are some of the things that happen when we have overdue project reports, as well as more information about the project outcomes report. The project outcomes report is very similar to the final project report, and that it is due by 120 days after the end date of the award. It is not approved by a program officer. The program officers may review it, but they don't actually approve it. It's published verbatim by what is submitted by the PI or the co-PI. Some of the other things that are on this slide, we do have notices that we send to the PI as well as the active co-PIs and the SRO, the Sponsored Research Office, to let you know that the reports are due or when they're overdue. I will point out on the due notices, they do start going out at 90 days before the end date of the project report. And if you really look at the policy, at that point in time, the NSF could technically consider you to be overdue with that project report. Because again, that APR, that annual report, should have come in at least 90 days prior to. So when we start sending you that notice, if we really look at this, you have not supplied that project report at least 90 days prior to the end date. We do give you that 90-day period, and we hear a lot from PI saying, well, I don't have to supply the report until the end of that 90 days, and that's not technically accurate. Again, it is at least 90 days prior to is when they should be submitted. When you get that first 90-day notice, it is a reminder, and you should get those submitted. Research.gov is where the project reports are submitted. Not only are they prepared and submitted there, but there's also a dashboard. The dashboard is accessible by the PI as well as the active co-PIs and the Sponsored Research Office. The PIs and co-PIs can prepare and submit the reports. The Sponsored Research Office does not have access to prepare and submit the reports, so they must come in from the PI or co-PIs. Now, I will say that a best practice for project reports is that someone at the Sponsored Research Office should be assigned the task or the duty to look at this stuff. And I would say probably on a monthly basis, if not more frequently, to determine what project reports are coming due or have become overdue. And there should be follow-up from the Sponsored Research Office to the program or to the principal investigator, the PI, or the co-PIs on the project, to find out why that project report is delayed. Because again, when it's delayed, it causes blockage of the approval of any funding and no funding actions. And it might start affecting drawdowns. The other thing that I would suggest is if you are having issues or there are questions, you can always reach out to the program officer as well as the grants officers in DGA. Let's go ahead to the next slide, please. What this slide is this slide actually pulls up the NSF policy as it is stated in the Proposal and Award Policies and Procedures Guide, the PAP Guide. The PAP Guide is our externally facing, basically, policy document that is available for external community. So if you read this language, the submission of the final project report and the public or the project outcomes reports for the general public indicates that you have completed the project. And by completed, that means you have completed the scope of the project. I would suggest that the program, that the principal investigators, the PIs and co-PIs not submit those project reports until they have completed the project. If you haven't completed the scope of the project, request a no-cost extension. Reach out to your sponsored research office, reach out to your program officer, and make sure, because once those reports are submitted, again, it is indicating that you are not anticipating any further action on that award. That means no cost extensions, supplements, PI transfers, because when we receive those reports, the NSF actually closes the award and does not allow basically any further action on those reports or on those awards. We also generally have a review process for if we get requests to reset those project reports to pending or to remove them. And it's a fairly rigorous process where you have to provide information about why you submitted it, even though you're saying that the project was not completed. And I also will mention that the submission of the project reports and the closing of the award does not affect drawdown of any payments for any expenses that were incurred on the award prior to the end date of the award. So again, if your financial office has an invoice that was for a piece of equipment that was purchased prior to the end date, but you did not get that invoice processed and payment requested prior to the principal investigator or co-PI submitting that project report, you can still enter that drawdown in ACMS. Let's go ahead to the next slide, please. This is basically, this screen is very simple. It is just a banner that is displayed on research.gov for both the project outcomes report as well as the final project report. I will also mention, I failed to previously, that the final project report is actually the final annual report. It is not cumulative. There's sometimes some misunderstanding about the final project report. Again, it is not cumulative. It is just for that final period. So if you see these banners, again, these banners are that alert that tells you that if you're expecting any further action on this award, or if you've not completed the scope of the award, you should not be completing those project reports, and you should reach out to your program officer. Let's go ahead to the next slide, please. And I will send it back to Michael.
Now, here I'm going to talk a little bit more about overdue project reports and how these relate to FAPPS, or the Federal Awardee Performance Information and Integrity System. So the intent of the FAPPS regulation is twofold. First, to hold award recipients accountable for performance, but then also to share their award performance across multiple federal agencies. And the goal of the sharing is to promote results-oriented grants making. Now, insofar as overdue project reports go, 2 CFR 200.344, which is the provision of the uniform guidance related to closeout, that requires that NSF report in FAPPS any recipient who's failed to submit all required project reports within 1 year of an award's end date. So this means that any annual, final, or project outcome report that's delinquent beyond 1 year of an award end date, that'll trigger a FAPPS submission by us at NSF. The delinquencies reported to FAPPS as a material failure on the part of the award recipient to comply with the terms and conditions of the award itself. So all federal entities, including the NSF, are required to evaluate a potential awardee organization's record in FAPPS prior to making a new award. So again, to just echo the point that Jeff had made, I'm just trying to emphasize to make sure that all of your reports are submitted, and also preferably on time. Can we go to the next slide? Just to re-emphasize the points that I made in my previous slide, the NSF has clarified when project reports need to be submitted and when they will become overdue. Dr. Panchanathan, our agency director, he has also emphasized the importance of submitting project reports on time. And he did this specifically in Notice 148. In that notice, he reaffirms NSF's position on report submission and also emphasizes the very important role that awardee authorized organizational representatives play in the report submission and tracking process. Because this is a very high priority to NSF, we'll actually be continuing to engage on reporting compliance through various oversight and outreach activities. So please stay tuned. Could we go to the next slide, please? So now we're going to pivot somewhat to solicitation requirements. So DGA, we in DGA, we review each proposal against its applicable program solicitation to ensure that the proposal meets the appropriate compliance requirements. For proposals involving human subjects, proposing organizations are required to conform to 45 CFR 690, which is the federal-wide policy for the protection of human subjects. For proposals involving animal research or vertebrate animal research, proposing organizations are required to comply with the Animal Welfare Act. So here now, the most important point here is that if a solicitation or proposal includes human subject involvement or indicates vertebrate animal research, DGA will have to verify that the appropriate IRB approval, exemption, or the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee certification, IACUC certification, has been submitted to the NSF before we can make the award. In cases where we might have a PI with a project that lacks definite plans for overseeing human subjects, you as the AOR could submit a certification invoking 45 CFR 690.118 and state that no work with human subjects, including recruitment, would be allowed to begin until the official IRB approval has been obtained. Next slide, please. So proposal budget review, this is really an area where we in DGA spend a lot, if not most of our time. And some more specific areas of concern where we look at are the participant support and other direct cost categories on the budget form. So for participant support, you'll want to pay attention to the definition of participant support costs, which is actually included in the NSF Proposal and Award Policies and Procedures Guide, or the PAPPG. That definition is pretty restrictive and specific, and it controls the sorts of activities and items that you could cover using funding designated as participant support. And so here, and I mentioned this, I believe, a few slides back, but you definitely want to be careful not to embed unallowable costs in the participant support cost category. In the other direct cost category of the NSF budget form, DGA tends to scrutinize the subaward and other categories. For subawards or budget line item G5, and this is following the NSF budget form, you'll want to make sure that a separate subaward budget is included as part of the proposal budget. DGA will not authorize a subaward arrangement that doesn't include a separate breakdown of subaward costs. And for, I had mentioned other, which is line item G6, it's important to disaggregate and list what's being requested. So for instance, if your funding request in G6 includes lab fees, software licenses, tuition remission, you'll want to be sure to itemize and list the costs for each of those requests. So that's readily, so it's easy to read for the grants officer. Next slide, please. So looking at indirect costs now, for institutions of higher education, the negotiated indirect cost rate agreement in effect at the time of the award remains in effect for the life of the award. However, as per guidance from the Office of Management and Budget, as well as NSF's PAPPG and FAQs that we've issued through the policy office, if the rate or rates used in the proposal are lower than the rate or rates in effect at the time of award, grantees may charge NSF less than the full negotiated rate. And in cases where this happens, the under recovery is considered voluntary uncommitted cost share, and NSF we urge our awardees to have or at least establish an internal control that ensures the rates proposed are not greater than those in the approved negotiated indirect cost rate agreement that was in effect at the time of award. Now, pivoting to budget justifications, these shouldn't go more than 5 pages, and each line item should be addressed. Typically, we see narrative descriptions for each cost item. And lastly, all funding requests should be in agreement with your own organization's policies and procedures. The request should also be in agreement with your own organization's cost accounting methodology. So to say this another way, you shouldn't be requesting that NSF fund something that your own organization from an internal standpoint would not support. Next slide. So here are some of the sorts of questions that DGA receives. And we had talked about participant support costs. And so please remember to carefully check what you're requesting to be covered by this particular cost category. You should also keep in mind that removing or rebudgeting funding out of the participant support cost category on a post-award basis, doing that requires prior approval from NSF. For subaward requests that are submitted on a post-award basis, these have to be submitted through FastLane or Argov, and they also need to have an associated DUNS number. You should also keep in mind that award management and oversight provisions, these actually flow down to your subaward organizations. So you, in effect, will have to conduct your own monitoring and oversight activities to ensure that each of your subaward organizations are also compliant with NSF policy. For closeout, we've mostly at NSF automated this process. That being said, if an award contains a special term or condition or some reporting requirement that needs to be fulfilled prior to closeout, for instance, if your award has a cost share reporting condition, in those sort of cases, DGA will work with the program office and you to make sure that these requirements are actually fulfilled before authorizing the closeout. Next slide, please. So this here is the research terms and conditions appendix A, and we only had space to include 1 of 4 pages here. But the document includes a list of restricted categories that require prior approval from NSF. And you can actually look at the specific NSF column on that. In some instances, you'll have a prior approval category that NSF has waived. And one of these would be, for instance, for rebudgeting requests between direct cost categories that exceed 10%. And in situations like these where you have authority to proceed unilaterally, we defer to you. So just overall, this, and again, it's only part of the matrix, but it's a really great resource to have on hand. It's also publicly facing and I believe also available on the NSF DIA's policy webpage. Next slide. So looking at long-term disengagements by the PI or co-PI, if you have a PI or co-PI that has to leave the project for 3 or more months, and some reasons would be personal reasons, or for instance, if they're going on a sabbatical, you as the authorized organizational representative should submit a prior approval request via research.gov. And going back to the previous slide, a long-term disengagement request, that would be an example of another restricted category in the RTCs that would require NSF prior approval. Lastly, it's important that you track what your senior project personnel are actually doing. So for instance, if they are actually taking that sabbatical or disengaging in some way from the project. And you would do this really to help them avoid the possibility of putting your organization at risk of award termination for non-compliance. And that's an outcome that neither you nor the NSF wants. Next slide. So here's a bit more on participant support costs. And again, participant support's another restricted category in the research terms and conditions prior approval matrix. But here, there are also some caveats that I want you to pay close attention to. And the first being moving or rebudgeting funding out of the participant support cost category requires prior approval from NSF. And in this case, moving funding out would require that prior approval would have to come from your cognizant program officer. The second is that while moving funds into the participant support cost category generally does not require prior approval from NSF, if you're rebudgeting funding and that rebudgeting action transfers funds into the other cost category of participant support, and this other cost category in the participant support line can actually be seen on NSF standard budget form. In these sort of cases, NSF prior approval will be required from DGA. And we had touched on this reason before, but NSF requires a prior approval review to transfer funds into the other participant support cost category so that the grants officer can determine if the funding request itself is allowable. Next slide, please. Now, on the theme of award oversight, we're going to talk a little bit more about NSF's monitoring activities. So NSF, here we have a number of tools at our disposal to monitor the progress of our projects. DGA's program officer counterparts, they engage in programmatic site visits to examine the technical and scientific progress being made on NSF's projects. On the non-science side, DGA and DIAS, we also have our own site visit tool, and this is called the Advanced Monitoring Program. And we use advanced monitoring to examine the financial and business aspects of the project for compliance. Our goal in doing these reviews is to identify areas where you as the grantee organizations could potentially improve your grant administration practices. We also incorporate audit findings from our internal or NSF OIG, in addition to any compliance or performance related issues brought to our attention by the NSF program officers. And we do this to better tailor our site visits for you all. And on the next slide, the next few slides, we'll go back to Jeff, who will talk about no-cost extensions.
Okay, talking about no-cost extensions, another fun category that there are lots of questions about no-cost extensions. So let's get into this. No-cost extensions do not apply to awards that have a zero balance. The logic there is if there's a zero balance, what is the project? What are you doing in the project? So no-cost extension isn't just to complete the final project report or the public or the project outcomes reports. Again, there has to be money left in the account in the award. I will also point out that the no-cost extension is not just because there are funds remaining on the award. So you can't get down to the end of the award, find out that you have $5,000 left and say, oh yes, I'd really like to use that $5,000 doing this. It's not about the funding. It's about the scope. Have you completed the scope of the award from the original proposal and or any approved NSF scope changes? So again, it's not about the funding, it's about the scope and whether the project has been completed. There are deadlines to submit the various no-cost extension requests. For grantee approved no-cost extensions, the awardee organizations have the ability and authority to submit those on their own. And they can be for up to 12 months. And again, they should be submitted within 10 days of the end date of the original award. NSF approved no-cost extensions can be approved or can be submitted pretty much at any point in time. Research.gov actually has business edits that will guide you as to what type of no-cost extension should be submitted. If you miss a particular deadline, say you were preparing the grantee approved no-cost extension and you slipped and it's now 9 days out from the end date, it will automatically block you from doing that grantee approved no-cost extension and will submit the NSF approved no-cost extension for you. The other thing that I will point out, the important thing about this slide is that last bullet point. Always verify that the no-cost extension has taken and that the end date has changed. There are occasionally system issues where the end date doesn't necessarily get changed properly. So I would recommend that you always go out and just verify that that no-cost extension updated the end date of the award to what you expected it to. Let's go ahead to the next slide, please. This slide has to do with canceling appropriations. What does that mean? Most NSF funds are not good forever. They have a cancellation date. This is based upon appropriation law. So NSF actually manages and alerts awardee organizations to this issue. So there's really not a lot that the awardee organizations really need to do on their own. I will go back to the appropriation law and that the appropriations are generally good for 6 years. So current year, fiscal year 22 funds will expire at the end of fiscal year 2028 if nothing else changes. The canceling appropriations generally only become an issue with standard grants. And that is because standard grants get all of their funding up front and they don't actually generally get any additional funding, or they may not get additional funding in the form of a supplement. So imagine a standard grant is awarded for 5 years and they get a no-cost extension and that pushes it to 6 years. So at the end of that 6 years, if they have not expended all of those funds may cancel. NSF, as I mentioned, sends out reminder or notices to the financial management folks at the awardee organizations to let them know that there are awards that might have canceling appropriations. It gives them basically some instructions on what they would need to do. And basically those instructions are drawdown funds. But again, it's not a drawdown funds just to drawdown funds. The funds still must be allowable, allocable, reasonable, necessary for the award. So it's not an alert to say, go out and draw down funds. I want to reiterate that. The other thing that I will want to I'll mention is research.gov. If you do go in to do a no-cost extension and the award does have funds that are about to cancel, you will get an alert message, and we'll see that in the next screen. I will also mention that this is not controlled by the NSF. This is appropriation law. Treasury actually will go out and take those funds back out of the accounts from NSF without NSF doing anything. Again, NSF does not have control over this. A couple more points. The drawdowns for any expenses that you do need to draw down and get payment for should be made prior to NSF actually has a shutdown date of the account cash management service, ACMS, available in research.gov. We generally shut down ACMS prior to the last day of the fiscal year. So even though the last day of the fiscal year is September 30, you would need to do your final drawdowns on any canceling appropriations by that date that we publish for the shutdown of ACMS. The other thing that you could possibly do is if you do have an award that falls into this category, you can reach out to your program officer, and in certain circumstances, what they can do is take whatever funds will be canceling, and they can use current fiscal year funds to basically replace those. But again, that's not a guarantee. You should reach out to your program officer to see what they can do. Let's go ahead to the next slide, please. As I mentioned, this page basically shows you the banner warning that you would receive if you're in research.gov trying to complete that no-cost extension. And the award that you're doing the no-cost extension has canceling appropriations. I would also note that this notice will pull up for any award that has canceling appropriations. So it is possible on a continuing grant that there were funds that may have been issued to you in a prior fiscal year that are about to cancel, but you still have funds from the current fiscal year that are still good. You would still receive this message. So this message is for whether all of the funds are canceling or whether only some of the funds are canceling. Let's go ahead to the next page, please. Okay, award transfers or PI transfers. This is a mechanism that the NSF has to move an award from one awardee organization to another awardee organization. Some of the things that I will point out here is that the awards are made to the organization and not to the PI. So when it comes down to a PI moving from one organization to another, the awardee organization that has the award has basically a decision to make, and they can take any one of these 4 actions. They can choose to have a new PI to replace the PI that is leaving. They can do a subaward. They can agree to transfer the award to the new organization with the current PI, or they can actually choose to terminate the award and end it completely. There are some additional things that could be done. So again, if there are questions, you can always reach out to your program officer or your grants officer to find out other things that can be done in terms of the award transfers. Let's go ahead to the next page, please. So some important things to remember about PI transfers. Career awards do not have options 1 and 2 available to them. So you cannot appoint a new PI for a career award. You also cannot do a subaward from the original awardee organization to the new organization. So those are not allowed as part of the career project or program. In terms of the established program to stimulate competitive research, EPSCoR, we have EPSCoR states and non-EPSCoR states. So if an award was made to an organization that is in an EPSCoR state and it included EPSCoR funds, those funds cannot be transferred to a non-EPSCoR state or an organization in a non-EPSCoR state. If you contact the NSF does have a way to maximize the amount of the transfer. But again, you must reach out to the NSF to do that. Another important thing is before you start that, if you are the original organization, before you start that PI transfer process, you should reconcile the award. And by reconcile the award, that is basically look for any pending payroll transactions, any equipment purchases that have not yet been billed or submitted for drawdown and payment, any subaward payments that have not yet been drawn down, any expenses that you might have that you have not yet drawn down, because again, that would lead to the NSF having a higher balance, and you might end up trying to transfer more than what is in the award or will be in the award. NSF cannot transfer more money than what is available in our accounting system to an awardee. So again, that reconciliation process is very important to make sure that the process is correct, because once that transfer is approved, NSF does not have any sort of a real mechanism to go back and retransfer funds. Say the original awardee left too much money on the original award and they now want to transfer that fund to the new organization. We don't have a mechanism to do that. Same thing is true if the original organization transfers too much money to the new awardee. We don't have a mechanism of getting money back to the new awardee. A couple other additional points that aren't really on this slide, but the PI transfer mechanism is not a mechanism to now split the award into two so that I can have performance happening at one location and a second location at the same time. No, with the PI transfer, the original award will get a new end date and it will end. And no cost extensions cannot be approved on the original award once it's end dated via the PI transfer process. It closes. So again, it's not a mechanism to split the award. It is also, while it is an award transfer process, it is the existing PI from the original award transferring to the new organization. So the new organization does not have an ability at the moment to change the PI as part of this process. So you would end up having to do the award transfer, have the new award approved, and then you could come in and do a notification and request for a change of PI or to add additional co-PIs. So again, that is not currently supported as part of the process. And the last thing that I would mention is please start early with the award transfers. The NSF actually we have received requests to transfer awards that were transferred a year ago. And that really shouldn't happen. So as the original awardee organization, when you find out that the PI is moving, that transfer process should start in a timely manner. With that, we can go to the next slide.
Once again, my name is Shaun Minick, Branch Chief for the Cost Analysis and Pre-Award Branch. Today, I will speak to you about the exciting topic of unallowable costs. Unallowable costs are simply costs that you should not charge to your NSF award based upon federal and NSF grant or cooperative agreement award policies and regulations. The inclusion of unallowable costs has the real potential of adding significant delays to the start of your federal award with NSF. Internally, our proposal approval process is multi-layered, and we have a tremendous amount of awards to approve over the next few months. Costs in your budget that aren't allowable will prompt additional questions and justification requests from our staff and may slide your proposal to the back of the line as we review other applicants. We believe the work you do is all incredibly important, and we want your award to start on time and start with full funding. Next slide, please. Information about costs that are deemed unallowable can be found in the Notice of Funding Opportunity or the solicitation, 2 CFR 200, the FAR, the Proposals and Award Policies and Procedures Guide or PAP Guide, and the Federal Travel Regulations. Links to these documents will be provided at the end of this section. Next slide, please. Now, I will give you a few examples of common proposal issues our cost analysts have routinely observed over the past few years. First, Proposed versus actual compensation salary charges received by the employee. Proposed labor costs for an employee using labor rates that are higher than what the employee is currently receiving, and the applicant could not explain the difference in labor rates. We look at the methodology used to determine the expected labor cost increase, and generally, we use the most recent federal wage increase as a barometer to determine what is reasonable. The next instance would be application of incorrect fringe and indirect rates. Your application should use your current federally approved indirect cost rate agreement or your fringe rate agreement if you have one. That will be issued by your cognizant federal agency. We do not accept internally developed or state-approved indirect cost rate agreements. Next, unreasonable travel costs or costs and higher than rates allowed. Generally, your travel costs should align with the rates established in the federal travel regulations. Any deviation from the thresholds established by the FTR need prior approval, and we will ask for specific justification for why the rates proposed exceed the rates shown in the FTR. Next, meals charged to the awards for employees who are not on travel status. Providing food for a working lunch or bringing in donuts for an early meeting for employees would be an example of something that we probably wouldn't allow. Also, when a group of persons with effort directly associated with an award go out for dinner and are on some sort of travel status, example could be visiting a visiting institution, some of those participants may be local and not on travel status. The meals for those who are not on travel status are unallowable. The entire bill cannot be picked up by the PI and charged to the award. Only those parties that are on official travel status. Next, we have the interesting topic of participant support costs. Participant support costs that are not adequately documented, especially meals, are typically unallowable. For a cost to be allowable, it must be reasonable and adequately documented. An invoice for a meal provided to participants should be supported by a list of the participants as supporting documentation and to allow for the review of allowability. We want to determine the cost per person. Also, the purpose and the necessity of the meal should be specified if the participants are not on travel status. Now, we understand some costs are typically described as team building events. For example, tickets to an amusement park or equipment. We've seen an Xbox for a common room to be used by participants. Unfortunately, these costs are typically unallowable as they are not necessary to accomplish the proposed objectives of the project. I want to say that if you are questioning a cost, if there's any confusion about the cost and its allowability, I would suggest reaching out to your program office or your grants officer for further clarification. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Shaun. You know, it is difficult to have a conversation about unallowable cost without also having a discussion about allowable cost. They are the counterpart, and it's important to understand the cost principles, which are found in the Uniform Guidance, CFR Part 200, Subpart E, really outlines those allowable costs and the cost principles. So the cost principles basically tell us all the things we must do in order for a charge to be reimbursed from the award. So these are the things we need to do. And when we don't do those things, there is potential that the cost will be questioned and disallowed. So let's look at these things that characterize allowable costs so that we may better understand unallowable costs. So looking here, what is allowable? Basically, allowable costs must be necessary and reasonable for the proper and efficient performance and administration of the award. So what's necessary? Necessary means that the project requires the goods or services. And reasonable indicates that charges made to the award reflect sound and diligent stewardship. We used to call this the prudent person rule, which suggests that you or I would not pay more than we should for a common product that's available. So that's allowable, cost, necessary, reasonable, and allocable. Basically, allocation is basically talking about distributing or apportioning costs for a specific purpose to a particular award or project. So I know when I think about allocation, I think about distributing workload or chores, and that's really simply what allocation is. However, when costs for two or more projects happen in proportions that can't really be easily determined because of their interrelationship and how the work is involved, then the allocation methodology must be documented so that we all understand, and the auditors, for example, understand where they're looking at a particular objective, how those costs are allocated across projects. When the methodology is not documented and there are two or more projects that can't easily be determined what is the appropriate or proportion of costs, then there's potential that those costs will be questioned and perhaps disallowed. Also, what we understand about cost principles is they have to be treated consistently across awards. And so really that means that if you have a state award, you can't treat those costs differently than a federal award. And next slide, please. Also, all costs have to be in conformance. Federal costs, federal awards have to conform with federal law. Awards with state funding and local funding have to conform to those laws. Also, remember that there are limitations and exclusions that may be identified in the terms and conditions of your grant agreement. So please keep an eye out for those, particularly as you are getting new awards. Also, consistently treated in accordance with GAAP. Costs are not included as match, and they are net of applicable credits. And last, but certainly not least, is adequate documentation. This is where the cost principles, all of those actions that we were talking about, the necessary, the reasonable, the allocable, treated consistently, documentation must evidence the conclusion that we have applied cost principles appropriately. So basically that means your documentation for costs, for example, might be effort certification. Purchase orders are organized. You're tracking awards in an accounting system. So all of that guidance is found in 2 CFR 2 Part 200 subpart E. Next slide, please. So with that said, what makes a cost unallowable? This is a very good question. The uniform guidance gives us a whole list of costs and a whole list of unallowable costs. But what we find is that some costs are unallowable in every circumstance, and I wanted to show that to you today. And some unallowable costs are allowable in other circumstances. So that means that you really do have to look at the terms and conditions, the solicitation, the proposal and award guide, the PAPPG, and you have to also look at any of the other relevant laws that apply to the particular objective of the project. So if we go down just these certain costs that are unallowable in every circumstance, they do ring sort of logically: alcoholic beverages, alumni activity, tuition benefits to family, bad debt, membership costs, those kinds of things. That's pretty reasonable, and I think we would all agree that makes sense. When we get over to what are generally unallowable costs but are allowable in some circumstances, this will depend on the goal and objective of the award that you're receiving. So under certain conditions, advertising and public relation costs may be allowable under the terms of your award. If that is the case, they would be budgeted for. You would have confirmation that those costs were allowable. Participant support costs, I think Michael went over that very succinctly, as has Shaun. The reason we are constantly and reiterating the participant support cost awareness is because we do see a number of findings and disallowed costs around participant support costs. We'll talk about that from an audit resolution perspective in just a minute. But also, please stay alert to things like conference cost and make sure that they are categorized correctly, and that when you are incurring cost around those, you understand what is allowable and what is not allowable. Next slide, please. So Michael went through and showed you, and there's a slide on the research terms and conditions, Appendix A, which pretty much maps out where prior written approval is necessary. But there are some other, inherent things that you have to know about prior written approval. That is that when in doubt, ask. If you're thinking about rebudgeting, or if you're thinking about, as we've talked about in participant support costs, adding an other category, you really need to understand and seek NSF prior approval. Want to spend a little time with subawards, the issue around transferring the research to a subrecipient. When that's necessary and perhaps unbudgeted, it is really critical that that request is made through research.gov. When it's not made through research.gov, it is a violation of the terms and conditions, and auditors do find that as a violation of terms and conditions, and the costs are questioned. And it's not just a technical issue. Research.gov gives us the ability to look at that whole award and really look at it to see if an amendment to the grant is required. When NSF determines that an amendment to the grant is required, then it will be signed by an NSF grants officer. So those are the confirmations that you will get when you do have to go through research.gov for an unbudgeted subaward. I think we've talked about changes of PI or co-PI, how important that is to make sure that if it's not budgeted, then you have prior approval and documentation for the change in research and scope. Now, unsupported expenses by subrecipients. It is important that, I believe Michael may have said that we give the award to the organization, not to the PI. So when research is transferred to a subrecipient, the prime is still responsible. The prime awardee is transferring their duties to a competent eligible subrecipient, and it's the prime's duty to ensure that that is the case. They conduct a risk assessment and they monitor the subrecipient, including ensuring that charges to the award are documented and substantiated, even including the record retention terms so that they're consistent with the prime awardee. When auditors come in and look at this particular area, they will go to the subrecipient to ensure that costs incurred do meet the cost principles, that they are necessary, reasonable, allocable, etc. Next slide, please. We've talked about participant support costs. We just want to reiterate the importance of understanding exactly what participant support costs require, both on your budget and any changes to them post-award. Also, with participant support costs, Indirect costs are not usually allowed on costs budgeted as participant support costs. We have seen quite a few findings where indirect costs have been repaid to NSF. Again, also, participant support costs must be accounted for separately in the grantee's accounting system. Auditors are looking for that, as are we at NSF. So remember that if you have approved participant support costs, they have to be tracked separately in the accounting system. And we've talked a lot about participant support costs and other category, entertainment. These are generally unallowable costs. If there is something related to the necessity of an award, please go through research.gov to put that request in and speak with your grants officer about any costs that are post-award. Next slide, please. And again, reiterating, meals and coffee breaks are not allowable costs for intramural meetings of the organization. Meals and expenses are not available to employees who are not on travel status. Shaun talked a little bit about fringe benefits, and we just want to emphasize one last time before we go out. Entertainment such as tickets, amusement are generally not allowable. And if something is needed for your award, do talk it over with your grants officer. Use research.gov to make the request. And if it's approved, that will be documented for you and the auditors to see. And I will turn it back over to Shaun.
As mentioned earlier, here are the links for some resources that can help you navigate allowable and unallowable costs as it applies to your NSF award. As you can see, the first 4 links are to pages previously mentioned in this presentation. The last link is for NSF's Division of Institution and Award supports training, tools, and research page. This page was specifically developed to assist awardee organizations meet compliance requirements related to federal assistance award management. Thank you for taking the time today to hear us out and listen to us provide this presentation. Now we'll throw it back to Michael.
Here we're going to briefly recap and go through some keys to success. Over the course of the presentation, my colleagues and I have conveyed how NSF goes about implementing and enforcing its policy and regulatory requirements. All of these requirements are publicly facing and accessible through just a simple internet search. So one of the tips here I have is that first and foremost, review the NSF PAPPG and the uniform guidance. Those are 2 great resources, and they're also available to pull up just through a simple Google search. Second is, I believe that Charlotte had mentioned this, but pay close attention to your notice of award. That document or that notice will contain the specific terms and conditions, things like funding restrictions, reporting requirements, and any other special instructions that you as the AOR will need to be aware of. Next slide, please. Another good tip is to make sure that your PI is actively engaged with the project. And this may actually sound surprising, but I've personally had to deal with instances where I've had PIs well into their award period of performance, but they haven't submitted any progress reports. So you don't want to be in that situation. So it definitely never hurts to track closely your PI's progress along with his project reports, their specific reporting requirements that are inherent to what they're doing. It's also a good idea to ask yourself whether funding requests are reasonable, allowable, allocable, and necessary. And this had been mentioned by my colleagues in CAP. And also it's good to have the appropriate control mechanisms in place to ensure that your organization can support a good or robust oversight posture. Next slide, please. And finally, on your end, make sure that your staff know their own responsibilities. Be consistent with oversight across all of your projects. And probably the most important pointer here, and I suppose my previous points alluded to this, maintain clear lines of communication. And what I mean by clear lines of communication is that you want to make sure who knows who's responsible for what. And for PIs, they should be directed in terms of who to communicate with. First, to the NSF program office for questions related to the technical or scientific aspects of the project. For administrative concerns and questions, PI should reach out to you all first, the SROs. Now for our SROs, you all should feel free to contact your cognizant grants officer for questions related to specific awards. And of course, you could reach out to the policy office for general questions related to policies of the National Science Foundation. And next slide. So here we've included some helpful links for your reference. And with that, I'll open it up to questions and also leave you with BFA's motto, which is ask early and ask often. Thank you.
Okay, I'd like to invite our presenters to come back on camera. We have been very busy answering questions in the Q&A while this presentation has been going on. We've received a number of questions from you. Thank you for that. What we're going to do now is answer some questions. My goal here is really to choose questions that we think will benefit everyone or the majority of people here, rather than very specific detailed questions that might be related to a proposal that you have or an award that you've received. So we are going to take some time to go through some questions here, and I will throw these out to our panel. The first question I wanted to just get a little bit more clarity, and I'll throw this to you, Jeff, is about project reporting and when annual reports are due. I know you went into quite a bit of detail about this, but it seems like there was a little bit of confusion on when they are due. Is it 90 days before the end of the budget period or at the end of the budget period? Can you clarify that a little bit?
Sure. I can talk about that, Jeremy. The PAP guide, as well as the terms and conditions of the award, state that annual project reports are due at least 90 days prior to the end date of the budget period. So again, that project report, the annual project report, should be coming in at least 90 days prior to. The reason for that is to give the program officers adequate time to review and approve those project reports. Because again, the project report it's showing the progress that the project has. So it's an important piece of the puzzle for the program officers to determine whether or not someone might get a supplement approved, whether they might get incremental funding approved, whether they need a no-cost extension, those sort of things. So again, that 90-day period is for the program officers. However, if that report is not submitted by that 90th day before the end date of the budget period, NSF starts sending the reminder notices saying, your report is due and you need to submit it. We send it at 90 days, again at 60 days, and again at 30 days. Technically, the report is not yet overdue from an NSF policy standpoint because we're giving you a 90-day grace period, so to speak. But again, it should have been submitted 90 days prior to. So if you're looking at it from that standpoint, yes, that first annual project report would only be for 90 days if you're following the terms and conditions of the award, or not 90 days, 9 months. That additional 3 months that you did not report on, you would pick up in your next annual progress report. So it would be for a full year. And at the end of the award, you're going to supply a project report that covers the entire period of performance for the award. I will also point out, I did see a question about it. The final project report is not cumulative. It is simply the final annual project report. So each one of those the annual progress report and the final progress report covers the entire period of performance of the award. They're not cumulative. The only report that is somewhat cumulative is the project outcomes report for the general public, the POR. That is supposed to be sort of an overview of the results of the project. So I hope that clarifies.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. The next question that I wanted to get to is about indirect cost guidance. Specifically, what should an institution do when, for example, they have an indirect cost rate that was one amount in year one, but then changed to a different amount in year two? How should the awardee deal with that situation? And I'm sending that to my colleagues over. I see Charlotte's ready to go.
Thank you. Yes, Jeff, it's important to remember that the most important part of this is that NSF should not be charged a higher rate than what your negotiated rate is. So that is the fundamental. So if your proposed rate if you had a proposed rate and let's say it was 52%, and at the time of the award, the negotiated rate was 51%, then you could not charge the higher rate. You could only charge the negotiated rate, which was lower than the proposed rate. It's important to realize that you cannot charge the NFS award more than the negotiated rate at the time of the award.
Great. Thank you, Charlotte. Was there somebody else who wanted to?
Jeremy, this is Sohel. I wanted to make a comment here. Depending on the rate agreement they have, if the institution has a predetermined rate, pretty much it stays the same throughout the duration of the grant. But if they have a negotiated rate that is provisional, then it could be subject to adjustment by the end of the year. So it depends on what type of rate they have in their rate agreement.
Okay, I wanted to also touch on some allowable cost questions. One being, are expenses for participation in studies, such as if you're giving gift cards out for participation in studies, or other prizes of minimal value, are those allowable on NSF awards?
I'll take that question, Jeremy.
Go ahead.
If you know those costs up front before you submit the proposal, by all means, budget them and justify them very well in the budget justification. If it is post-award, I strongly advise you talk to your program official and perhaps your grants officer before charging those costs, especially as it relates to participants. But generally speaking, gifts, gift cards, incentives, things like that are not considered necessary for projects. So do check with your program officer, but if you check with your program officer, also check with your grants officer, because the auditors are all over those types of costs and they will question them. And if we don't have enough documentation that tells us that they are necessary and reasonable for the carrying out of that project, we will disallow them.
Great. Let me get to tracking different types of costs. So we talked a bit about participant support costs and how those are tracked in the budget. Are there other types of categories that NSF expects awardees to track separately, such as supplements or other types of categories that they should be tracking separately?
So participant support cost is kind of unique for NSF and always has been. If we're supporting a project, funding a project that has training cut out and specified for participants, students, what have you, we require that you all track those costs so that we can see that you're meeting the objective of that training activity. Outside of those costs, participant support costs really is the only one that we ask you to track separately. If you're going to, request things like, again, T-shirts or something like that, but still under participant support costs, again, we want it tracked separately if it's for participants, but it also should have prior approval, whether you submitted it under the proposal and defined it and justified it in the budget justification, or whether you come in post-award. Any costs that are outside of the definition of participant support costs, that's a stipend, subsistence, travel, or registration or conference fees, those costs must be pre-approved by the grants officer in writing before they can be charged to the award if it's post-award.
Thank you, Rochelle. Let me pose a couple of questions on no-cost extensions. We did answer a number of questions in the Q&A as the session was going on about no-cost extensions. Question is there a too soon time to submit a no-cost extension? So, for example, does it have to be, do you have to be within 90 days of the end of the award to request or to submit a no-cost extension? I think, Michael, that was a question for you.
Sure, and thank you, Jeremy, and I appreciate the question. So the way no-cost extensions work at NSF is the first is, or can be issued unilaterally by the awardee organization. The second is has to be reviewed and approved by the program officer, and the third no-cost extension is reviewed and approved by the cognizant grants officer. So to actuate approvals for these, there has to be, money remaining in the account, and then also there has to be some incomplete scope that is used to justify an extension of the period of performance.
Okay, and then keeping with that, if you have a 5-year award, is it possible to have a no-cost extension that would take the award past the expiration of the appropriation of those funds?
Absolutely. So if in this hypothetical, if you had an original award with an original appropriation and that appropriation was supplemented, you'd be able to extend the period of performance of the award based off of the supplemental funds that were issued in some outperformance year. But from an appropriations law standpoint, it would not be possible to continue to extend the original, so the non-supplemental appropriated funding.
And I will just quickly jump in that we covered this in the award management session, but it really is not that common of an issue for most of our awardees. The NSF will reach out to your financial folks, to your financial administrators, generally in December, if this is going to happen to any of the funds. So generally from December through September of the next year, the NSF is working with you all if there are funds that will cancel. And again, it is not something that happens to most awardees. It is fairly rare.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, and this is about transferring an award versus subawarding an award to another organization. So, and perhaps Jeff, this is one for you, but can you talk about what are the advantages of one over the other, whether you subaward to another organization or transfer the award to the new organization?
Well, as we mentioned several times in the presentation, the award is made to the organization, not to the PI. So the organization gets to decide what they want to do with the disposition of that award. So if they want to keep the award, and subaward to the PI's new organization or not do a subaward. Again, the complete disposition and handling of that award is up to the original awardee organization. I don't know if Michael or Rochelle or Shaun can talk about, or Sohel could talk about what the benefits of a subaward are. I guess the subaward allows the original awardee to keep the award themselves and manage it themselves without transferring it to the new organization.
Yeah, I think what we're seeing, and I'll just tell you what we're seeing on an audit resolution. The original PI at the original awardee institution decides to leave that institution and go to another institution. And sometimes the university and or the NSF program officer really wants that PI to stay on that award. And so when the PI goes to that new institution, they can still be the PI on that award at the other institutions. Maybe they have graduate students or other students working and staying at that original awardee institution. And a subaward makes sense and allows that PI to still serve as the PI and still supervise and oversee the research and training of those students. That's what we see most commonly. Does that get to the question or concern?
Yeah, I think that's a good response. Thank you both. I do want to take a moment just to thank our presenters and all of you for joining us today. Again, I want to thank you for participating, and please do join us at 3 p.m. today Eastern Time for 2 separate sessions, which will cover the work of the Office of International Science and Engineering and the Office of the Inspector General. We hope you have a wonderful day, and thank you so much for attending.